Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. I'm also working with my co-coordinators, Story Oates and Mabel Baldwin-Chafer, who will be helping me behind the scenes. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska, our partners and the communities we work with, and how we connect with your community. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. This school year, we're presenting monthly webinars that feature NOAA science and collaborations with partners across Alaska. We're aiming to present perspectives from the communities we work with, as well as research conducted by established scientists and students. Today, we're introducing you to Janessa Esquible from the Association of Village Council Presidents and the University of Alaska Fairbanks College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, Ed Farley from NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and Mary Simeon from the University of Alaska Southeast. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Indigenous communities who have substantial Indigenous knowledge and much to share with us. Janessa is honored to be presenting to you all from Anchorage, Alaska, the ancestral homelands of the Dena'ina peoples. Ed and Mary are presenting from Juneau, Alaska, the ancestral homelands of the Occoquan and Taquaquan Tlingit people. We'd also like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from Seattle, Washington, the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Duwamish people past and present. Story is joining us from Juneau, the ancestral homelands of the Occoquan and Taquaquan Tlingit people, and Mabel is joining us from Benta or Wasilla, the ancestral homelands of the Dena'ina and Otna peoples. These communities thrive thanks to the continued sharing of vision, wisdom, values, and leadership of these Indigenous communities and their stewardship of their lands and waters since time immemorial. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speakers. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions. We encourage you to ask them as we go and we'll be keeping track for our speakers. We'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. Okay, I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Janessa, to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janessa Esquible. My Anishinaabe name is ZB, and I'm really grateful to be here today as a Damamta Fellow through the University of Alaska Fairbanks, as well as a Marine Resource Specialist working with the Tribal Consortia Association of Village Council Presidents. And today I'm going to speak with you all a little bit about my dissertation research around salmon stewardship and Indigenous livelihoods in the Kuskokwim region of southwestern Alaska. Ani Janessa Esquible Nadishnakaz Wawiatanang Nindojaba Ajijak Do Dem. I wanted to introduce myself in our Anishinaabe Mwan language. I am originally from Detroit, the Great Lakes region, and Ojibwe and Potawatomi territory. I'm Crane Clan, and I'm also Mexican American. We can move to the next slide. So this dissertation project and research is part of a much larger research project, statewide project actually, throughout Alaska, and it's led by Dr. Jessica Black, who's from Nenana and Fort Yukon, and many other amazing scholars. We have many advisors, elder advisors and partners all around the state of Alaska who contribute and shape this work in many different ways. And so I just want to thank and acknowledge my amazing team members and advisors. And we'll move to the next slide. So the main goal of this project, and we can, is really to document Indigenous values, knowledge, and governance systems that are all connected to salmon across Alaska, and to use this wisdom and knowledge to improve current salmon science and management processes for everyone. Next slide. So, as was mentioned, this research is situated in the Kuskokwim region of southwestern Alaska, and we had an honor to spend time in the coastal communities of Kongiganack and Queenhawk. the lower Kuskokwim River community of Bethel, the middle Kuskokwim River community of Aniak, and the headwater community of McGrath as part of this research. Next slide. So these are some of the guiding values and principles. So it's important when you're doing research within Indigenous communities, regardless of what discipline you're in or you might pursue, to think about what are the values and principles that really ground the research of which you're doing. All of these values and principles I've learned about from other scholars, from my family, from my mentors, and are included here. One of which is respect. We also have reciprocity and redistribution. So thinking about in what ways as researchers are we giving back to the communities that we're working with, and giving back in ways that may not be in alignment with simply the project objectives and the project goals, but giving back even beyond the scope of that. And our responsibility, thinking about what are our responsibilities to the community members and the communities that we're serving and representing in this research. Thinking about relevance, so how is the work that we're doing, the research that we're carrying out of meaningful to the communities that we're carrying this work out in? Relationality is referring to the relationships, our relations and our connections to the land, to the rivers, to the fish, to the wildlife, to the plants, and also to the knowledge holders, Indigenous and community knowledge holders that we've had an opportunity to spend time with through this work. And then another core principle and aspect to think about when you're carrying out your research is really reflexivity. And so what reflexivity is it gives us time throughout the research process to come back to and think about what are our aims, what are our intentions, what are our positionalities, and how might that positionality impact the research itself, and what are our responsibilities to our relations and to the communities that we're engaging with through this process. Next slide, please. So here we have a slide, and I'm just going to quickly go over this because we don't have too much time today, but these are core methods that we used in this project. This project was Indigenous-led, so our team worked with Indigenous leaders throughout the state of Alaska to carry out the research in a way they saw was best fit in their own home communities and nearby communities. Tribal and community engagement occurred since the inception of the project, since the beginning of the project, and throughout the entire project itself. We spent a lot of time investing in and working with and empowering youth and involving them in this research. So we were lucky enough to work with Destiny Ropati, pictured here in the middle, Danielle Lowry, and Avery Hoffman. All played a really important role in this research and helped in many aspects of this project. We also carry out multi-generational semi-directed interviews. So we had the honor to spend time with, I believe the largest interview had spanned 5 different generations, and this really added a lot of richness and depth to the interviews. And then throughout the project, we spent time on the land and river, fishing, berry picking, so really emphasizing the focus of simply spending time in community to build relations. And with this, we'll move to the next slide, please. And so I want to take a moment here and acknowledge that all of the Indigenous and community knowledge holders who really shaped this work, I would not be here without them. And there are several are listed here, and others who respectfully declined to be acknowledged by name. And with that, we'll move to the next slide. And so here is a word cloud showing some of the key themes, right? So we take we transcribe all the interviews, and then once we transcribe them, we code them, or we come up with these themes, and we start to try to understand what are the most commonly occurring themes that are coming up throughout all the interviews. And you'll see here, there's Indigenous stewardship practices and several others. And in the next slide, I'll speak to one of these themes. So we'll move to the next slide. One is on Indigenous stewardship and Indigenous traditional knowledge systems. This is from Elder Okalina Morgan and teacher over in Aniak, who shares that her culture is and always has been one where we believe in the importance of sharing, especially with those who are less fortunate, with widows, with those who don't have the equipment or transportation to go out and process fish. Next. please. So sharing was a critical Indigenous stewardship practice and value that was expressed across all interviews as very important. Next, respect of the land, respect of our harvest, of our catch, respect for each other. Next, please. And awareness, this being a really critical Indigenous stewardship practice and value. So awareness of how we behave when we're out fishing and hunting, being respectful of each other, being respectful of how we even speak amongst each other when we're out fishing and hunting and on the land. So being aware of this and being aware because of its impact to our non-human relatives like salmon. Next, please. And then this is another core Indigenous stewardship practice of taking only what you need. And we'll move to the next slide. And so one of the other themes that we'll end with today, and I wanted to talk about, is subsistence ways of life and food and livelihood sovereignty. And this is well captured from a quote by Yupik youth and fisheries biologist, actually Avery Hoffman from Bethel. And if you all could play the audio clip, that would be great.
My connection to salmon started at a very young age. I was driven to fish with my father and grandfather anytime I could. For me, it felt like a rite of passage to finally be able to fish on my own and to provide for my family. The joy on their faces when I return with fish is the greatest feeling in the world.
So Janessa, just to remind you, I think that the video muted you, so unmute yourself.
Thank you. We're going to be ending soon. I just wanted to emphasize that this joy of living and continuing the subsistence way of life was really central to this theme across all interviews and expressed as being very connected to well-being. And so with that, we'll move to the next slide. And I just want to say, Kuyana Miigwech, thank you to everyone who joined us today and for listening, and to all of our funders and partners. And we'll be moving on to the next presenter.
I think what we'll that we might stop here and take a few questions first. So for all of our audience members, if you have questions, there's a question box that you can put them in, and we will flag them behind the scenes and take them. So, and if you're submitting questions from a class, make sure that you put in what grades your class is when you ask the question as well. So we did have some questions that had come up. One of the questions that was submitted was, what does it mean to indigenize salmon science?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I think we actually asked this question during some of our initial circle dialogues, which I didn't have time to speak to today, but these were some of our gatherings where we brought together tribal leadership and tribal organizational staff. And one of the questions was, what does indigenizing salmon management mean to you? And a lot of the responses were centered around Indigenous involvement in fisheries management, Indigenous peoples at the fisheries management decision-making tables, bringing our Indigenous values, our cultural values, our stewardship practices, our governance systems, and centering them in fisheries management.
Thank you so much. Sean from Harborview, 4th grade in Juneau, Alaska, from Mrs. Curry's class, wanted to know, how long have salmon been living in Alaska?
Probably over 10,000 years. Someone correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I have to say that I don't know the answer to that myself, but you know, that's a very good question, Sean, and I think that's something that you could probably do a little bit more research on as well. So we did have a couple other questions. One of them was, is there one theme that you felt was important out of the answers that you were getting from your interviews, or that you connected with personally?
That's a good question. One theme, what was the first part of the question?
So it was, is there one theme that you felt that was really important or that you connected with personally?
Gotcha. Yeah, I think the most commonly occurring theme was around Western management. And so around like fisheries management practices and fisheries research. I think like on a personal level, I was able to connect with and understand that theme of Western management, Indigenous stewardship practices, ecosystem changes, subsistence ways of life, more so through my time living and working along the Kuskokwim, where my family and I lived for almost 6 years. So I think directly being there and living by the river and sharing a lot of time with Indigenous and community knowledge holders in a place that's very different from where I grew up, I was able to relate to and understand these themes a bit more deeply, I think, through my time spent in place.
Thank you, Janessa. And then we had another student question, which was, did you find any differences in what people's experiences and points were from the different communities that you were doing interviews in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it varied. One of the things that stood out to me is just the ecosystem is very different from the coast all the way up to the headwater community, and like the abundance and the type of fish that people have access to, or the type of fish and wildlife that people harvest throughout the region, it varies and it can be different. And I think perspectives as well, like around fisheries management and like perspectives on being regulated, being overly regulated in some cases, also varied throughout the region. But there were a lot of similarities in terms of Indigenous stewardship practices and the importance of subsistence ways of life.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more questions before we move on. One of them is from Gracie, from Mrs. Curry's Harborview 4th grade class in Juneau. And Gracie wanted to know, how many species of salmon live in Alaska, and are they the same species in Western Alaska that live in Southeast Alaska?
So I have not spent too much time in Southeast Alaska. In Western Alaska, we have pink salmon, the humpies, we have chum, that are also referred to as dog salmon. We have silver, also referred to as coho salmon, red, referred to as sockeyes, and kings referred to as Chinook salmon. And I really couldn't speak to what salmon species exist in Southeast Alaska, as I haven't spent much time there. I'm not as familiar with that area.
So Gracie, that's some homework for you to be able to look at the types of salmon that Janessa just listed off and see whether there are the same species in your area as well. And then from the class in Unalaska, 2nd grade, they wanted to know, how do you fish on the river?
So on the Kuskokwim, that's also someone had asked, like, are things different? Like, did you hear different responses throughout the watershed? And yes, so people do fish differently. And in the lower part of the river, coastal areas, drift gill netting is very common, and that's actually where I learned how to drift gill net, was on the lower part of the Kuskokwim and Bethel. If you move up the river, the middle river community, like in Aniak and McGrath, they still have fish wheels, and they use fish wheels up there, and they also do drift gill netting. People hook and line, like, seems to be that hook and line is more popular during the silver salmon season when they're starting to run. And then in recent years, because of fishing restrictions, people have also started to utilize dip nets, and that's become more popular in some parts of the river as well.
That's interesting. I was wondering whether for our students you might be able to describe what a fish wheel is.
So a fish wheel is, this is a tough question, as I I lived in the lower part of the river where fish wheels don't exist, but I did live by the Copper River for a bit, and our neighbors were gracious enough to let us use their fish wheel. They put it out and set it out in the water, and the current basically, you need like a stronger current for a fish wheel to operate. And it's just, it just spins in a circle, and as it touches with the bottom of the river, it picks up fish, and often it scoops them and puts them into like a live box where the fish stay in the water, and people usually check the fish wheel pretty frequently. A lot of communities, like when I was living by the Copper River, and it's my understanding in some of the Middle River communities of the Kuskokwim, that they have community fish wheels where different people share and take turns checking the wheels and harvesting fish from them.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah. So for those students who are wondering what a fish wheel was, I think that after the webinar, you could probably go onto the internet and search on fish wheel, and you might be able to come up with some descriptions or pictures. But I like the description that Janessa just gave. And I like the idea of the fish wheel as something communal that everybody can take part in and share. Well, I think that it's time for us to move on to our next speaker. So, Janessa, I have one last question for you, which is, if you had any advice to give our students, what kind of advice would you give?
Well, from this project and through another project that I'm working on right now with coastal communities on Yukon and Kuskokwim through my work, there has been so much emphasis on the younger generation and elders, adults wanting the younger generation to carry on the subsistence way of life. And so that would be the advice that I would give is, please, listen to your elders, like take any opportunities that you can to go out and go fishing, spend time on the land, spend time on the water with your relatives and friends. And I know there's technology, a lot of kids are into technology now and on the phones a lot, but it's really, really critical that these important cultural values, traditions, and ways of life are carried on into the future. And your elders want you to have these critical survival skills and to carry on this really important subsistence way of life. So that would be the advice that I would have for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Janessa. We really enjoyed your presentation. All right, so we'll move on now to Ed Farley's presentation. Take it away, Ed.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. My name is Ed Farley, and I'm a research fish biologist working with the Alaska Fisheries Science Center here in Juneau, Alaska. Next slide. So I grew up in Washington State in a place called Kelso down in Southwest Washington. I circled it there in the red. Washington is known as the evergreen state. It has a lot of trees. Where I grew up, a lot of those trees were harvested, and there were mills in the area that would take the trees and make lumber out of them to build homes. Next slide. And like at one point in my time, like many of you, I was once in grade school, and this is just the Catlin Elementary School that I went to in Kelso, Washington, and my favorite thing was recess back then. Next slide. I moved on and graduated from Kelso High School, and while I was at that high school, I was on the swim team. Next slide. And from there, I moved to Seattle, which is north of Kelso, and I went to the University of Washington, where I studied mathematics and computer science. Next slide. So what sparked my interest in fisheries? Well, back when I was in college up at the University of Washington, my family purchased a set net permit for Bristol Bay sockeye salmon fishery, and I started spending my summers up on the Igigik River, which is located in that part of Bristol Bay in Western Alaska, and commercial fished for sockeye salmon. I would get there in June and leave sometime in August, and that helped me pay for my college. Next slide. But while I was there, I noticed that this is just a figure of the total returns of Bristol Bay sockeye salmon. What you notice is that some years there are high returns of sockeye salmon. In other years, there are sort of average returns. And then in other years, there are really low returns of sockeye salmon. And so when the returns were high, that's very good for people who were commercial fishing. And when the returns are low, that's not so good. And so what sparked my interest was to try to understand why some years were high and some years were low. It's what scientists call variability, and that's what we're trying to understand, the changes in the number of sockeye salmon returning. What's causing that? So next slide. So at that point in time, I decided that I would go into more university studies, and I applied to go to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the School of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences in Juneau, Alaska. And I moved from Seattle to Juneau, Alaska in 1993 and finished a master's in fisheries in 96, and I got a PhD in fisheries in 2008. And I was fortunate enough to do both of those on Bristol Bay sockeye salmon. Next slide. And during the time that I was getting a PhD, I also got a position here at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center here in Juneau, Alaska. So next slide. And a lot of the research that I did over the last 25 years has been in the ocean, trying to understand what's happening to the ocean conditions in terms of the temperature, in terms of the food web, and what that might mean for small fishes. And during that time, I've spent time on the Oscar Dyson, which is a research vessel, some of the commercial fishing vessels that we chartered, such as the Sea Storm and the Northwest Explorer, for example. Next slide. And part of my interest has been in salmon and trying to understand the marine or ocean life history for salmon. But for those who may want to understand more of the salmon life cycle, we know that the adults, those are those fish over there in the red, in this picture, come back and spawn in late summer and fall in fresh water. They deposit eggs in gravel. Those eggs then hatch sometime around late winter, early spring. We call those alevins. And from there, they move on and they start feeding in the freshwater environment, and they are known as fry. But at some point in time, they begin to move away from freshwater and go off into the ocean. And at that point, they're called smolts. And from there, until the time they become adult again, they put on about 90% of their weight. So the ocean, the marine environment is really important to get the fish large to come home again to spawn. Next slide. And so what I've done, and we're working with a lot of others over my career, is to study the effect of how climate variability, in other words, cold years, warm years, extremely warm years, or just average years, might have on the marine environment that young salmon and young fishes are swimming in. And we focused on the young fish because we know that these fish need to get through that summer and get a lot of growth and put on fat in order to survive winter. And so during the ocean surveys, we collect a lot of information. You can see on the middle slide there, there's a carousel that's collecting information on the ocean. So what we're getting there is temperature of the ocean. We're getting how salty the ocean is. We take information on the amount of nutrients in the ocean and the plants that are also in the ocean. So we can start to look at the base of the food web and how that's changing varying during these high variability warm and cold years. We also use a rope trawl to collect young fish. And there's some pictures here of some scientists that are on the vessel that are taking stomachs out of young juvenile salmon. And from there, we look at what the fish are feeding on. And then we take the length and the weight of our juvenile fish, and samples of those fish come back to the laboratory here in Juneau, Alaska, so that we can determine how much fat or how well off these fish are prior to going into winter. Next slide. And so through all the research that's been conducted in the ocean, we have a pretty good idea of where Western Alaska chum salmon spend their time in the marine environment. And we know that fish from the Yukon and other places in the Norton Sound, for instance, spend their first summer at sea in that northern Bering Sea region, as you can see here outlined in blue. And then after their first summer during fall, they will move off and migrate down into the Gulf of Alaska where they spend winter. Now, chum salmon can spend 1 to 4 years in the ocean, and from the time that they're spending in winter, they will move into the Bering Sea for summer, fall, and then potentially move back into the Gulf of Alaska for winter before at some point in time becoming maturing and beginning to return back to go spawn. Now we know that that first summer at sea is a very critical period for these fish. As I mentioned before, these fish need to grow very large and they need to put on a lot of fat reserves in order for them to make it through winter when there's not as much food availability. And so when they make it into that Gulf of Alaska ecosystem, again, having better condition will have higher survival. Next slide. And one of the things that we've noted through our time series of information in the northern Bering Sea in relation to the chum salmon juveniles that we see there is that the ocean temperatures do affect the food web and the prey quality that juvenile chum salmon are feeding on. And what we're noting is that when it's extremely warm temperature, ocean temperatures, we see them feeding on low quality prey. And those prey consist of jellyfishes and other things of that nature. Similar to if you were just feeding on celery yourself, you know, you can get nutrients out of celery, but you're not going to put on a lot of fat. And so the jellyfish diet doesn't really give them a lot of fat content. However, when we see the ocean is cooler and we have cooler ocean temperatures, there's a different prey food web available to the juvenile chum salmon. And we see them feeding on shrimps and small fishes and crabs. Those prey items have higher calorie content and higher fat content, and that gives the chum salmon a better ability to grow and to put on fat prior to winter. And we see that changing between these warm and cool temperatures. Next slide. And so connecting that then, that information on that early marine life cycle, the first ocean year of these chum salmon to what we're seeing in terms of their response, we note that there was an extremely warm temperature, ocean temperature event that occurred in 2017 through 2019. And that event also occurred in their winter habitat in 2019 in the Gulf of Alaska. And it's through that connection that we saw later a real decline in the number of adult chum salmon returning to the Yukon River. And so we believe that this warm, extremely warm temperature in the ocean provided a very poor quality prey, and these fish did not get fat enough to survive. Next slide. And so what was the favorite part of my job? I liked doing the work in the ocean and advancing the science through peer-reviewed publications. The short story that I just told you was just recently published. And there are a number of other publications highlighting the research that we've been doing in the ocean over the last 25 years. Next slide. And my final word to you is to become scientists. We really, because the planet needs you. We do know that over the last 100 years, our planet is warming and we're seeing real changes in the ecosystems that salmon are occupying. And science is can mean many things. So we also want to make sure that we bring all science into this conversation, which includes Indigenous science and Western science, because we need to bring Alaskans together and have as much information as possible to help us understand what's happening with fish and salmon in the ocean. And next slide, I think that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed. And for our audience, if you have any questions, please use the question box again to type them in. We really enjoy having your questions. We did have some questions that came in while you were doing your talk, Ed. So one of the questions was why is there lower quality food when the ocean is warmer?
So when the ocean is warmer, what we're finding, especially in these regions that had cold water in the past, such as the northern Bering Sea, there is a different food web that's being transported up into that region, and that food web has coming from the south in warmer oceans is now being transported up into the northern Bering Sea where it had been cooler. And because it's warmer up there, those prey items are surviving and at higher numbers. And so that's how we see these higher numbers of lower quality prey, and the prey that's higher quality doesn't do as well in these warmer temperatures, and we see less of that. So the salmon are feeding on what's available to them, and so when it's warmer, other these lower quality prey are being advected or pushed north using currents up from southern parts of the ocean up into the northern parts of the Bering Sea.
Great, thank you. We did have a question from an Alaska, the second grade class there. And the question was, what can kids do to help the ocean?
We need to keep our oceans clean. So yeah, definitely recommend recycling. We note that in the oceans, especially where salmon are in their high seas environment, there's a lot of plastics out there. So, you know, we as individuals and kids need to remind everyone that we need to keep our oceans clean so that our fish have pristine environments to live in.
Well, that's interesting because and related to that, one of the questions was, do you find plastics in, like you look at what juvenile fish are eating, are any of them eating plastics?
We haven't seen any plastics in juvenile fishes. I'm not sure. I think that's a good question for everyone to go research, but I do know that when salmon are out in the open ocean, in the North Pacific Ocean, in the high seas area, there have been some studies that show that there's a minor amount of plastics, but I don't think that it's all species. So that's a good question.
Yeah, it's interesting. We also had one more question from Corina saying, why doesn't the salmon just follow the higher quality prey farther north for winter?
Well, you know, there's a genetic component to migration along with the temperature component, and it's very interesting to see that these salmon, even though it's warm, will continue to migrate into other areas of the ocean that their predecessor fish had done. So there's a genetic component to their migration pathway. Some fish will change their distributions, but for salmon, what we're seeing is that, you know, they'll spend their first summer out in that same area that they've spent their first summer for thousands of years, and they'll migrate down into the Gulf of Alaska. That's for Western Alaska stocks. Other stocks don't seem to do that. They have different genetic migration patterns, and some of them aren't as affected by the warming because of that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And Ed, I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit about our next speaker is Mary Simeon, who is a student intern that we hired in to connect to your research project. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we had some funding from the North Pacific Research Board to get a better understanding of what is happening with Western Alaska salmon. We had data. We have data from our Northern Bering Sea, and then data from an International Year of the Salmon survey where we looked at the winter habitat for salmon. And so Mary is here to help us get a better understanding of what's happening with Western Alaska salmon, and was funded through the NPRB project to provide information as from the presentation that she's going to give.
Great. And with that segue, we'll move on to Mary's presentation. Thank you so much, Ed.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Mary Simeon, and this is my project. I'm from Bethel, Alaska, and Bethel's the little star that's on the left side. Okay, this is how I got my start. I grew up around water my whole entire life. I On the left side is a picture of me and my dad and him comparing me to the size of a salmon. And the bottom picture is me and my sister when we used to go stare out at fish for hours. And the top one is me fishing when I was about like 5 or 6. And the real start of my career was when I did this project with the Math and Science Expedition, and it's about juvenile coho salmon. And it's on the bottom right. And after that, I got asked if I wanted to go on the Math and Science Expedition, and I said yes. And the picture on the top right is with me and Janessa, where I first got my start into fisheries biology. And on the bottom left is me looking at juvenile salmon and taking their lengths. After that, during high school, I went to Malashkum High School, which is a boarding school in Sitka, and that's where everything started just rolling. I did a bunch of science classes. I did a bunch of internships. I did a class called C-Tech where I met my mentor, Story. And I also worked at the hatchery, which is on the top part, for 2 years. And then I also did the George River internship. And last spring, I got the opportunity to work for my professor and collect juvenile pink salmon. And the title of my presentation is Oral History of Chum Salmon, the Tales of the Legendary Kuskokwim Salmon. These are my 4 mentors that helped me throughout my project, and they helped me create questions during my interviews, and they also helped me just create this whole project. And I got help with things such as the consent form, the questions, and what to do with the transcript after I got done recording all of the interviews. Okay, the biggest part of this project is that I got to choose my own project. I sat with Story and my other mentors for many hours, being able to choose what I wanted to do. And the biggest thing that came to my mind was that I wanted to interview elders that I felt were important. And I got to choose the questions. I sat for many days thinking about questions I could ask. And I also got to choose the people who I interviewed, which were 2 elders along the Kuskokwim River who I've grown up around. And I've gotten many good information from them, but also grew up around them. So it's just, yeah. Okay, what is oral history? So basically, oral history is just storytelling about your life. And my project will soon be on the NOAA Voices. And on the bottom right is the QR code to the NOAA Voices website. Okay, what did I interview people about? I interviewed people about chum salmon along the Kuskokwim River and their history with them and how they feel about the current populations. And who did I interview? I interviewed 2 people along the Kuskokwim River who I've grown up around, and they've had a big impact on my life. And on the bottom left is a picture that my dad took with him smoking salmon, and on the bottom right is us going drift netting this summer. Okay, example questions for my project this summer. Can you tell me what it was like growing up where you did? Can you tell me more about your history of fishing? When you think of salmon, what is your best memory with them? What are some ideas you might have to help preserve chum salmon? Can you tell me some more activities that you do in your town? And what are some of your main concerns about the future chum salmon populations? While doing interviews, you also have to kind of go with the flow and think of questions on the spot. And it's able to branch out like sort of the questions that you've already asked. And some of these questions, like, can you tell me some more activities that you do in town, is just able to get like a full history of the person and what they've done in the past and how important salmon might be to them. And for my future work, I will continue to network with people. I might be a co-author for a future paper. And in January, I will be doing the Alaska Marine Science Symposium, and my work will be on the NOAA Voices website. Okay, my biggest advice to all of you is saying yes to as many opportunities as you possibly can. That's how I got to where I am now, and I'm very grateful for that. Yeah. Thank you to the people who helped me with this project. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. And once again, for our audience members, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question box for Mary. I also wanted to let you know that Janessa put a source, a link into the chat box, which is a source for the people who are interested in how long people have been fishing for salmon in Alaska. And then there's another link for how long salmon have been in Alaska. So for those of you who asked that question, there are a couple of things to follow up on. Mary, we did have some questions that came in. You had, in one of your slides, you showed a picture of Janessa with you when you were much younger. Can you tell us a little bit about how you met Janessa?
Yeah, so my teacher was taking care of these juvenile salmon in a tank, and I was really interested in them, and she told us about this project. And then after that, I got in touch with Janessa about the project. And then after that, she asked me if I wanted to go to the math and science expedition up the Salmon River, which is pretty close to Aniak, and I said yes.
Well, and that's an example of exactly what you were talking about, which is say yes to all opportunities and you know, reach out and talk to people. So that's great. So did you do some independent research then with Janessa as a result of that project?
I got the data from the math and science expedition from the year before.
Got it. We had a couple other questions that came in. One was, how did you decide on what questions to ask in your oral history interviews?
Yeah, so I really sat with myself and thought of a lot of the key values in my culture and my community, and I was able to go to people like my parents and my family and see what was important to them, and that's sort of how I got the role onto what questions I should ask.
Nice. What's the most interesting thing you learned from your internship?
I think the biggest thing, most interesting thing is how interviews actually work. Because I thought I was just asking questions, but it's a really long process, and I'm very glad I got to do it this year.
Oh, and actually, Mary, I was going to ask you whether you could talk a little bit about the practice interviews that you did.
Yeah, this summer I interviewed 2 of the other interns at NOAA, and I got to practice with them and ask them a few questions, the same questions that I did this summer with the elders, and it was very eye-opening because it was 2 people that I didn't expect to interview, and I got many different answers out of it.
Neat. And we have a question of what was your favorite part about doing oral histories?
I think just being able to become closer with the people who I interviewed and being able to hear their story and being able to record it and then still being able to look at it.
That's great. I really liked your definition of oral histories, that it's storytelling about your life, because I think that's, you know, we all have stories about our lives, but we don't often think about our lives as stories to tell people. And so I like the way that you defined oral history. Mabel had a question that she wanted to know, what is your favorite salmon recipe?
There's galmathuk, where it's like half dried and then we boil it and then we have it with onions and potatoes. That has to be my favorite.
That sounds good. let's see. I think that we had another question about the project. So there was a picture of the where you were standing in front of a board. They wanted to know what kind of project you did for that.
I think it was looking at the different ages of the salmon. So I think I used a couple years worth of data from the math and science expedition and looked at the years that they were staying there. So I think I can't explain it right now, but it's basically looking at the different ages before the salmon leave to go out to the ocean.
So when you were, from the pictures when you were growing up, it looked like you had a lot of experience with salmon, and so people wanted to know whether you've always been interested in salmon or whether you think you might branch off into other areas.
Yeah, so right now I'm majoring into marine biology with an emphasis in fisheries biology, but at first it was fisheries biology, and then once I moved to Sitka, I would change it to marine biology because it really opened my eyes to everything. But when I was a kid, I would spend hours on the dock outside of my parents' cabin staring at the fish, so they've always been something that's been really valuable and interesting to me.
Great. It's really impressive to see how strong that interest has been over the years with you. We did get another question of, would you recommend doing an internship like you're doing, like the one that you're doing right now, to other students? And was it hard to come up with a project?
Of course, I would recommend this. This has been my favorite thing because this is the first project where I've been able to create what I wanted to do. It was a little hard to do that because it's usually been with like an internship where it's given me like a list of things I need to do. And with this internship, I got to choose what I did. And it was something very new, and I'm very glad I got to do it this year.
And another question was, did you like developing the project with your mentors?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work. I really liked it though, because it opened my eyes to a lot of things, and it's helped me like sort of bridge knowledge systems, which has been a really big thing to me recently.
That's and actually that's one of the things that Janessa talked about talks about in her studies, is bridging knowledge systems between Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And I like the fact that you felt like you were able, that you were doing that somewhat in doing your oral histories. So I had another question of what was your experience working with the Science Center? I guess that means the Alaska Fisheries Science Center during your internship.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, it was just like, what was your experience? How did you like it, or were there challenges working at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Juneau?
No, it was really easy. I really liked it. With this internship, I'm able to be a full-time student and still work on this when I have time to. So it's really easy to be able to work on different things while also doing this.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for talking about your project. It was very exciting to hear about your project, and also to hear your thoughts about co-developing it with your mentors and being able to decide on the project yourself. And so if there is one takeaway thought that you have, I know that you've already given your advice to students, which is to try everything that comes up, but is there one thought that you'd like to leave the students with before we end?
I think trying new things. If there's like an internship you think you you're not really interested, try it. It might bridge you into something new. That's how I got into marine mammals, and that's why I'm going to marine now.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, I think one of the things that as mentors we've noticed is that you're always very open to things, and we really appreciate that that you come prepared with questions, and you've been thinking about your project and come to ask what direction you should go with different things. And I think those are important things as well. But I think that your thoughts about being open to new ideas and new things and trying new things is really important, and it's good to hear that from you. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. We have Janessa and Ed and Mary. Thank you to our presenters for 3 very interesting presentations. And for those of you in our audience, we are hoping to have another NOAA Live Alaska webinar in about a month. So please stay tuned, and we'll be sending out a flyer. But I really appreciate everybody tuning in for our presentation, and we will see you the next time. Bye-bye.